working feature and you met your next business partner, employer, you name it. That sounds like a lot of fun. Apparently, you're gonna hear my voice a lot today. If you have a chance to like pour one out for Danny and wish him better, we miss him. I am double moderating today to cover, so I'm glad to be here. We started with conversation about big multinational global going through transformation. Then we had a chance to talk to the startup world, and now we're moving into economic development, infrastructure. How do you create opportunities for people? And what does the impact of remote work have on local communities? I'm going to let each of these people introduce them real quick. As a reminder to everybody, there are profiles. So if you see somebody and you're like, who is Tracy? You can just type her name into the side. She wrote a lovely bio for you all of 30 seconds ago. And now you'll see it and it's ready for you to check it out. So you can even follow up with questions and DM her afterwards if you want to know more about how do I move to Cork, Ireland and live a robust and vibrant life. She probably can tell you. Intro, do it. Come on.
Sorry, would you want me to give you an intro now from me?
Do it, fire it, one sentence.
Okay, my name is Tracy. I'm co-founder of a non-profit called Grow Remote. What we do is make remote work local. So we made public our kit for building local communities, no matter where you are, and 130 people across multiple countries came on that journey with us. In Ireland, we're funded just recently by the government and just set up our first team and are ready to kind of grow again. And that is me, I think.
That is awesome. You write, that's like my daughter's sentences. She's like, I could do 9-line sentences. All right,
I can't follow that one up nearly as well as Tracy did. That was awesome. My name's Lance Robbins. I'm a consultant with Distribute Consulting, and here we work on helping governments design and implement comprehensive remote strategies that will impact their economic development initiatives, particularly around rural economies. And we look at that as a really comprehensive ecosystem building journey.
Yeah, take it up, Aaron.
Hey, everybody. My name is Aaron Belsley. I'm a consultant based here in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the U.S. In 2018, we launched Tulsa Remote, which is a talent recruitment initiative to bring remote workers from all over the world to Tulsa. And now I'm working as a consultant, helping other communities around the world.
Oh my gosh. Welcome back.
We're back.
I don't know what happened, but Aaron, I heard that you work helping communities all over the world.
That's correct. Helping communities all over the world attract talent.
Heck yeah.
Do you want me to repeat the rest of it, or are we good?
I heard everything else. I'm going to go on the limb that so did everyone else.
Cool.
All right, so I'm gonna start with a couple of questions because there's some angles. I just saw something really fascinating happen, and this is maybe a deep cut, but it'll lead in. Oh no, they missed the end of Lance and most of Aaron. We are going to do this again. Lance, oh, you know what? I'll go a cappella. Lance works for a crew that helps governments figure out how to create strong infrastructure and communities to support remote work. Aaron is taking a very successful program that he helped launch in Tulsa Remote and figure out how the rest of the world can implement similar things. Is that right? Or did I get it wrong? You want to correct me?
Works for me.
All right. We'll roll with that. I'm sorry, everybody. All right. So here's a bit of a deep cut. I've never met a government in California who didn't like to apply more taxes. But just recently, the governor of California vetoed some tax bills. And his statement in his veto was something, I'm paraphrasing, was in an era where Californians just realized how mobile they are, let's not make it harder for them to stay. And so suddenly now we're looking at a very mobile workforce in the last 6 months that's realizing they're not tied to, they may be tied to family and other things, but from an economic perspective, they're not locked in the way they used to be. I'm curious. Some people are aware of that. Others aren't. How do you reach into local communities and really drive awareness of the opportunities that are out there so that they can take advantage of it.
I'll go. Sorry.
You
Yeah.
can.
Okay.
You guys are so polite. Just go for it.
Okay, so this is something really interesting to me in terms of reaching into local communities, because there's a big gap between the world of remote work and the world of our communities, certainly in regional and rural communities. So what we do is we take a couple of different approaches. We go through local authorities, local governments, brief them, get them up to speed. We go through but we find local people the best. So particularly in Ireland, there's a brilliant network of community developers. So people who run like the farmers markets and all those things. And they were our people, we were them. And it's going to them and it's giving them all of the information around remote work and going back to basics on who is GitLab, what is automatic, what are you sure this isn't a scam? Is this really a multi-level marketing scheme? All that kind of stuff that you need to sit down with somebody and help them answer. And from our perspective, change happens, at the kitchen table. It happens at the side of sports fields. It happens when somebody's home for Christmas and they say, I'd love to stay home. And because you've been integrating with the community, they're able to say, oh, do you know that you can work for this company? And maybe they might even know a local remote worker. And then Aaron, I think, mentioned in passing the notion of exposure and how important that is. And exposure to remote working and remote workers and all of that entails is really important. So for us, packaging up remote work, putting it in a neat box in a way that's able to be deployed anywhere, we have a platform for that called ChangeX. And then adding onto that through governments and local chambers, etc. That's how we do it. And it's all obviously freely accessible to everybody. And that's the most important piece.
But how do you build that? So for example, I live in the Canary Islands. Unemployment for people under the age of 25 it's in 60%, if not higher. And with tourism going down because of COVID, it's going to get worse. How do you inform and build trust for this group of people who have no idea it exists, who maybe don't trust it? Like, what are some of the tools in your belt that allow those opportunities to suddenly become present and viable?
I think for us, I learned a lot from gender equality and from the work in that space. And, you need to see it to be it. Not always, you can be stuff without seeing it, but it's great if you can see it. And so we like to take people who look and talk like us and bring them into communities and say, well, look, Enda can do it. You can probably do it too. Enda's actually a guy who works for Shopify in Ireland. And he speaks like a normal rural Irish person. And he has this job.
Which means nobody but his neighbors understand him.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
So, and that is it. It's role modeling. It's showing the stories, and it's empowering people, and then people tell their friends, and then you kind of get that multiplier effect.
So I feel the exact same way that Tracy was talking about. So much of it is about exposure. And when we originally launched Tulsa Remote in 2018, that was about a bunch of different types of exposure. First and foremost, there were so many people who didn't even know what the city of Tulsa was like. And they might have had a misconception about what it was like. And by bringing individuals in, you can slowly change perception because they're connected to so many different individuals. But those individuals that come in are also connected to so many different companies. And so that exposure then causes individuals within the community to start considering different pathways that they hadn't before. And I think that the governor in California was smart to be thinking that way, just like the mayor of San Francisco is smart to be considering the fact that they are going to lose companies and people now that there's so much more flexibility with where you can live.
So I was thinking to add as well to the conversation that when you have this skyrocketing unemployment rate, like you're talking about in Grand Canary, or a lot of rural communities especially struggle with unemployment and underemployment. That means you have a standing workforce that's ready for opportunity. And so it's one thing to bring talent into a community, but it's another thing also to equip an existing workforce. And so, like from our perspective, we think about workforce development as sort of stage one of this kind of ecosystem of economic development, leveraging remote work. And so upskilling and providing the training, regardless of what channel that comes through, to a standing workforce that would like to be employed, but just doesn't see the opportunity. And so when we can upskill for the virtual workplace and then help to connect with these companies that we're talking about,
And Lance's company introduced us to Workplaceless, and we were able to bring that into our local communities and train people up. So that for us, I'm skip past training, but that's a big thing, accessibility of this work.
Is there money for that? Like, because I remember, I mean, I've been around a while, and in the early 2000s when the dot-com bust happened, there was a point in my career where I found out that the county of Santa Cruz and the counties of Monterey had re-education training funds. Like the government just had the money. You literally had to walk in and be like, I want to learn this and I need money. And it was there, just nobody knew how to use it or take advantage. Is that normal? Like, are some of the organizations you're working with, and how do you help people tap into those funds so that they can get the education to then chase that opportunity?
I can speak for the U.S. There is an enormous amount of funds that have been set aside for COVID relief that could be leveraged by communities to enact programs that could support the development of a large remote ecosystem within their community. And I think that there are limited restrictions in how that money can be spent. So I would encourage everybody to start researching what is available and see how they could leverage it to do programs that kind of speak to the future. And I think that, like you mentioned in the beginning, the California governor is now considering the fact that individuals are going to have the flexibility to move to wherever they'd like. And so cities need to stop paying attention to building an ecosystem that supports very few companies that manage multiple individuals, and start focusing on the individuals that could potentially bring resiliency and diversity to cities that had never been seen before.
Is that it? I don't know, Tracy, does Ireland have similar economic buckets to pull from that you know of?
We're funded by one of them. They have regional enterprise development funds, and they're specifically built for kind of ground up momentum, where we see a problem that we see and we know and we have the hunger to solve, and they will fund us to develop solutions for it, and that's how they funded Grow Remote. But I think there's a separate kind of piece around what Aaron just said. So we're hopefully bringing Aaron into the Irish kind of government division soon, because this is something that we could be leveraging much more. We don't have the skill set to do right with that particular piece. But definitely for us, we found the funding is there. If you have to do it small, prove the model, which is what Aaron had said, and then you're flying it really. Touch wood, you're flying it. You will get support for a good idea. Yeah.
And I wanted to add as well, a bit of an appeal here is that this at the federal level, there are some resources, but there's a lot of grant writing and it's convoluted and it's difficult. And every local government has to start the process from scratch, just about here in the US anyway. And I see that there's a big opportunity for corporate to come in and to support the economic development movement that is really needing to happen to support really struggling regions. I think that government, particularly at the federal level, is going to be very far behind. And this is an opportunity for the private sector to make a massive difference if we could get them on board, right?
A great example actually is Microsoft have an aim to train up 21 million people in the world. I mean, it'd be great if part of what they did there was remote working, upskilling, right, and doing that. They fund the setting up of Grow Remote communities in the US and the UK. They'll give you $1,000 to do that. And for us, that's been a huge help, right? And it's been a help for the local, it doesn't come to us, goes straight to local communities. But that corporate funding and that corporate backing is just significant. It's really valuable, yeah.
That's awesome. So let's hit the other side then. Have you seen cities, counties, countries doing, like, leveraging this opportunity to generate economic growth? Like, what programs work? Frankly, should regions try to attract from, like, your story is one of those models of like, we'll pay you 10 grand, come to Tulsa. It's going to be awesome. Was it awesome?
Well, I mean, I think it was awesome. I'm no longer with Tulsa Remote because I've moved on to start consulting with other communities, but I get to still see the individuals that have moved to Tulsa because of it. And I can tell you that it's pretty awesome to have them here. And I like what everybody was talking about with the fact that you can start programs small and continue to grow them as you see success. When we first launched the program, it was small, and now it's grown. And I think I've heard reports that it's going to beat all expectations for this year, bringing in hundreds of people in the year and a half that it's been around. And I think that very much so that communities should start considering attracting remote workers, but it doesn't mean that they have to attract remote workers with incentive plans that pay them. It's about understanding that there is a major shift that's happening, and for cities to be an option in the future, they have to start considering creating an environment that's conducive of the worker of today and tomorrow. And that means creating an environment that not only supports but celebrates remote workers and provides infrastructure that potentially is needed. And I think companies need to start considering cities that are actively doing that to find their staff, because it is an abundance mentality, right? To Lance's point, it's not just about attracting, it's about growing the talent and providing them more opportunities and flexibility within your community. And I think by actively working to develop ecosystems that celebrate remote workers, companies are eventually going to identify that city as a key place to hire talent. And so you provide far more resiliency and diversity industry-wise for your communities.
So Lance, for example, I know your org goes in and helps a lot of different municipalities and groups figure out how to create the infrastructure necessary for a successful program. What are some of those baselines they just have to have in order to, like, if you have no internet, how far are you going to get?
Yeah, it starts with connectivity. Absolutely, Shane. So yeah, broadband connection, and then there's so many options now, right? Where technology is.
Dun, dun, dun. Welcome
Where
back.
should we pick up from?
I don't know. Let me ask. I thought what you were saying was brilliant. I'm sad everybody missed it. Thanks. We're going to go now. No, let's pick up. So it starts with broadband. Let's hope people still hear us.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So it starts with broadband, and technology is coming along fast. Like there's more options than there were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So this is coming to pretty soon coming to a place where, like, even rural regions aren't going to be without excuse pretty soon, right? So I think really, first of all, getting in here and finding a way that we're going to bring internet connection to the communities that we're serving. Now, if we're not talking about a rural area, then maybe the hurdles are less, but starts with a connection. And the other thing that remote workers need too is, like we've learned through COVID, that working from home isn't always ideal, right? So like my spouse is here, my kids are here, my dog is here, my neighbor's dogs are barking nonstop. There's construction right outside my house. Like I don't have a professional, quiet place to work. So what do? We need resources around co-working spaces. Like obviously Nomad City's done a fantastic job of creating that here. But what are the structures as well, because remote work's not 100% virtual.
I think that's a big deal from a diversity perspective too. It is a very privileged idea to assume that you have a spare bedroom or a quiet living room or any kind of space where you can actually think a coherent thought from start to finish.
Yeah, and where employers are putting expectations on their team members, right? You have to have this kind of background, and you have to have, this kind of internet speed, and all these things. Like maybe we should consider what is the local resource that can support a community of remote workers, even if we don't have broadband at everybody's houses, or everybody's house doesn't have a home office.
And I think, Lance, to bounce off of that, I think it's about intentionality of space as well. We use so much space on a daily basis just for individuals to sit in a cube when there's no real need for them to be there. It's not about the fact that office space isn't going to be desirable in the future. It's about the intentionality behind it and when you're there and why you're leveraging it. And those individuals that are considering that in communities today, I think are going to be the winners tomorrow.
What about tax? Oh, go ahead, Tracy. I'll ask after.
Just to give you, an insight into co-working spaces. In Ireland, we have about 800 co-working spaces across Ireland, right? If you go into a field, you'll find a co-working space. We just built them everywhere. But the problem we have here is that the companies in Ireland who employ people remotely don't allow or pay for use of spaces. So we need now to go into the companies and go, how do they meet your security, your data, all of those kind of needs that you have? And also, can you give a stipend like a lot of the fully remote companies would? But we need these other companies to do that too. So although we built the spaces and it might even have the remote workers, it hasn't just connected just yet, but it is very close to, I would say.
And what I've seen is that the remote or the co-working spaces, at least that I've visited, they're not always conducive for remote work. They're conducive for small companies to collaborate. But when the people in Tulsa Remote came to Tulsa and they're having to compete for the same conference rooms or the same phone booths, that's not a conducive environment. And individuals will eventually start working from home on a regular basis if they're privileged enough to have that space, which then leads to isolation and loneliness and causes turnover. And larger issues. So I think people reconsidering what a co-working space should look like when it comes to individuals that are interacting with distributed teams on a regular basis, I think is really important.
It's a big deal because I invested in some very early co-working spaces, and after about 2 years, I stopped attending because the nature of my work changed. I went from being a heads down quiet worker to somebody who's responsible for communicating with people. And being on calls all day in the middle of a co-working space, nobody actually appreciates that. Like, you're the loud, obnoxious person who's, so there are, depending on the role you're in. Yeah. So let me pivot and ask, somebody in the audience asked this, it was on my list as well. I'm curious how taxes play a role. I let in a little of that, but as people have the ability to both shift places, have we seen the tax incentive programs actually make a difference in shaping where population shows up, affecting how people choose their work? Are they a useful tool, and how does it actually affect the individual from an economic development perspective? And if you all have nothing to say about your use.
Oh, I'll jump in. I think that it really comes down to how those tax dollars are leveraged. I think if you just create an incentive program to attract individuals in your community, you're potentially going to have a lot of pushback in a lot of different ways. And you're going to identify individuals that are only interested in the transaction, and the relationship's going to end once the transaction is over. But if you leverage those tax resources to develop the infrastructure that actually supports remote work, even if that means seeding remote workers in the community in one way or another, it will long-term grow into an organic growth model where people just want to be part of that community. So I think that the tax incentives are a smart move if you know how to leverage it and how to use those resources.
I'm interested in what Tracy is going to say about this.
I don't know if I was going to say anything, but I know, so in Ireland, we have an organization called the IDA. They attract in big companies for offices like Google, Facebook, Salesforce, all of those that kind of have their headquarters in Dublin. You've got really good tax then around that. Lots of, debates around that too. But what we need now, I suppose, is that, but for individuals. And we're only beginning either for individuals or, so for instance, when the IDA landed Shopify into Ireland, they now employ over 400 people without any office. They're fully remote, but the jobs are ring fenced into Ireland. That was a good deal because the jobs are less competitive in terms of we're going to get the jobs, right? They're not all across Europe. And so it was a good deal. But to do that again and again is probably where I think Ireland in particular might have a bit of an edge, a bit of a competitive edge, because it's something that we're good at. But I think what Aaron just said is something that hasn't yet been introduced into Ireland. And I think that's something that we really want to introduce. You asked, Shane, was it important? There's communities in Ireland where the school will close depending on whether one family moves in. So like one person moving in is a huge deal. It keeps the school open. It keeps the post office open. It's totally worth 10 grand. I would pay 10 grand for it. It's totally worth it. You could do a fundraiser in the community to get 10 grand up and running, to get somebody there to keep everything open. So yeah, for us, it's a big deal. But for us, I think it's kind of attracting those Shopifys maybe for locationless employment within Ireland. They did that with Wayfair too. I think that's an interesting one.
So just to add on to that, Tracy, what you said really connects well with what I had in mind, is that we've talked a lot about worker incentive, talent attraction incentives, also incentives for corporate participants as well, because we have corporates who have HQs in big cities. I'm thinking from a US perspective, right? Like Twin Cities, Minnesota is a huge spot for large corporations to have their HQs. How can we encourage those employers to employ residents of the state of Minnesota. So the tax dollars from employment and employees stay within the state. And that's a big thing that states want to have, or I would think provinces or nations would want to have happen when we talk about a remote worker program. And so we want to incentivize the hiring of a local employee, even if it's remote, for the employer to do that.
We have 5 minutes left. And so with that 5 minutes, you have so much exposure to different experiments that people, companies, organizations have tried. Are there any where you saw that and you're like, oh, frack, that's really creative, and saw some results? And the people who are listening who have influence into organizational economic development all over Spain, Europe, Central and South America could just use a couple good ideas to take home. Like, what if you just sowed seeds for 5 minutes? Hit it.
Is it cheap just to say that I think Nacho and RePeople is an amazing example of a program that I'm going like, dang, that's the way to do it. I really think it's about an abundance mentality and not limiting the activities that you're doing as a community. It's not just about attracting new talent. It's about training new talent. It's not just about incentivizing individuals. It's also about showing companies that you've got amazing remote talent within your community. It's not just about convincing people to move there. It's about building infrastructure, physical infrastructure that will support people in intentional ways. So that would be my addition to the 5 minutes of ideas.
There's just so much around community here, right? That's the word. That is like the word for this session. It's around community, right? We look at our communities. How can we support our communities? Really, just look into your community. And like I was just saying earlier, like how can employers in the community decide, okay, I'm going to benefit my community more than I'm going to benefit my bottom line here, and in turn, like it comes back, right?
Y'all come from predominantly English-speaking organizations. Most of the companies out there, historically up until 6 months ago, offering remote jobs were from predominantly English-speaking organizations. How important do you think it is for somebody who wants to get remote work or be a contributor to the remote community right now to be able to speak English, German, like where a lot of these giant multinational conglomerates or startups are coming from? Is that important? Or do you think we're going to see an upswell in companies from other languages doing the same thing?
We're working with an organization in Germany, Newland 21, and they're doing really good work around rural rejuvenation in Brandenburg area. And they're working on German-based organizations and transitioning them from in-office to remote. They're also really focused on remote roles with German speaking. Just as you mentioned German, maybe it's because I'm looking for it, but I'm seeing loads of stuff with German-speaking roles. So there's that. But I think actually, certainly the trend that I'm seeing in Ireland is, prior to now, you might have been remote across the time zone or across the world. A lot of Irish companies will be remote within Ireland. Our banks, things like that, they don't necessarily want to go across a whole time zone. And I think other areas, other countries with other homegrown Indigenous, say in France, speak a lot of French, right? Indigenous going out remotely, but just within the country. And I think we'll have more incentives for that. That's my guess around the kind of localization of remote. I think I know it seems kind of counterintuitive, and it definitely is. But for some in economic development, it mightn't be so counterintuitive because it allows us to keep jobs, but keep them. Yeah.
I think that the most beautiful thing about remote work is that it gives us an opportunity to switch from the historic way of building our life around our jobs to building our jobs around our life. And with async work, it also allows far more inclusion. So while I can't speak about companies that are hiring requirements, what I can say is that it allows us to be in a situation where if somebody isn't as strong in English as they potentially might want to be, async work and remote work allows them to control their environment where they can be successful. And that doesn't just go to inclusion when it comes to languages. It's also other aspects when it comes, any kind of aspect that you can think of when it comes to inclusion. And I think that's really important to consider.
I'm going to stop because you've basically done my intro for the next speaker.
Good. Cool.
Good job, man. So we are at time. Thank you. If you're interested in knowing more about how you can help drive opportunities in your local community, maybe drag some of these people into the coffee in the expo area. You can have up to 20 people chatting at once, and go specific. Be like, what can I do here? Here's a scenario. Give me some idea, because these 3 people right here get paid to help governments figure this out, and you have access to them for a few minutes before they go on to what's next. So there's a rare opportunity. You should take advantage of it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
This was
Shane.
great.
Well,